There's a moment in every high-profile trial that the cameras love, and it's usually the same moment. A mother standing up in front of a room full of strangers begging for her child's life. It's raw, it's uncomfortable to watch. And in the Karmelo Anthony case, that moment lasted maybe 2 minutes. The fallout from it hasn't stopped for months. Because here's what nobody warns you about when you become the parent of a convicted killer in the middle of a national news story. The trial ends. The sentence gets handed down, but you don't get to go back to being a private person. You become something else entirely. A symbol, a target. And in a case this racially and politically charged, the punishment doesn't stay in the courtroom. It follows you home. That's what we're unpacking today. Welcome back to Brian's Criminal Unmasking Crime. If you watched part 1, you already know I don't do surface-level coverage here. We go into the parts of these stories that mainstream outlets touch for one news cycle and then drop. What I'm about to walk you through today isn't really making headlines right now, but it is escalating, quietly, in the replies and comment sections and doorsteps of people who, legally speaking, did absolutely nothing wrong. So if that's the kind of story you want more of, hit subscribe, tap the notification bell, because this channel goes where a lot of others simply won't follow. Let's start with the mother. Her name is Kayla Hayes. During the sentencing phase of her son Karmelo Anthony's trial, she was the only witness the defense called. Prosecutors didn't call anyone. The defense called one person, Karmelo's mother, and she did what, honestly, I think most parents in that chair would do. She begged. "He's my oldest," she told the courtroom. "He's my firstborn." She said he would always be her baby, that she loved him. It was short, it was raw, and by every account of people who were in that room, it was genuine. That testimony lasted a few minutes. The consequences of it have lasted a lot longer than that. Within hours, and I mean hours, not days, of the sentencing being finalized, Kayla Hayes' social media accounts were flooded. Not just angry comments, which fine, maybe you'd expect some of that in a case this divisive. I'm talking about doxing. People posting things they believe to be her home address, her workplace, details about her daily routine. The kind of information that has one purpose, and it's not debate, it's intimidation. And the messages themselves went far beyond "I disagree with the verdict." People told her directly that she should have raised her son better, that she was, in some moral sense, responsible for Austin Metaf's death. Some went further than that, arguing she should be criminally charged as an accessory for what one popular framing online called creating a murderer. Let's just sit with that phrase for a second, because I think it tells you everything about where public sentiment went. Creating a murderer. That's not a legal argument. There's no statute for that. It's a moral judgment being dressed up as one, and it's being aimed at a woman who, by every piece of reporting and every court record available, is not a suspect, was never charged with anything, and has not been shown to have had any foreknowledge that her son was carrying a weapon that day. Now, I want to be really precise here, because this is where a lot of commentary on this case goes wrong. Kayla Hayes is not on trial. She was never charged. There is no evidence, none that surfaced publicly, none referenced anywhere in the actual court proceedings, that she knew about the knife or had any advance knowledge that her son intended to hurt anyone. Her tragedy is not the same as the Metaf family's tragedy. I want to be very clear about that distinction, because it matters, and I don't think acknowledging her pain requires minimizing theirs for 1 second. Two things can be true. Austin Metaf's family lost their son permanently, and nothing about what I'm describing today changes the weight of that loss. But what's happening to Kayla Hayes is still worth examining, because it reveals something about how the public processes a crime like this. There's a psychological shortcut a lot of people take without even realizing it, collapsing the distinction between the person who did this and the people who happen to be related to the person who did this. Proximity gets treated as complicity. Being someone's mother gets treated as being an accomplice. And once that shortcut takes hold in a large enough crowd, the backlash stops being about accountability and starts being about something closer to punishment by association. The real-world toll of that has been concrete. not abstract. Reports have indicated her employment situation has been affected by the attention. She's been approached and photographed without consent in public spaces, parking lots, errands, the ordinary places a person exists during an ordinary day, by people who apparently feel entitled to treat her like a public exhibit rather than a private citizen going about her life. Now let's talk about the father, Andrew Anthony, because his experience runs on a slightly different track, but it lands in the same place. Reports coming out of interviews the family has given describe Andrew facing pressure at work tied directly to the case. Co-workers approached by people using what he's described as intimidation tactics dressed up as journalism, and pressure campaigns aimed at getting him removed from his job entirely. In interviews since the verdict, Andrew has talked openly about how disorienting all of this has been, how, in his words, he didn't realize how cruel people could be until this happened to his family. And then there are the younger siblings. Carmelo Anthony is the oldest of 4 children. His younger brothers and sisters had absolutely nothing to do with the crime, obviously. They were kids living their lives, going to school, and then suddenly their last name became a nationally recognized flashpoint in one of the most racially charged criminal cases in the country. According to the family's own accounts, the harassment got severe enough that they pulled their other children out of school entirely during the trial, not as some overcautious move, but because the threats and online harassment had escalated to a point where staying enrolled wasn't considered safe. One of the younger children, by the mother's own description in public interviews, became too afraid to sleep alone in her own bedroom because of the fear surrounding the family. Let's call this what it actually is: collective punishment. There's a phrase that circulated online during this case, something along the lines of, "the whole family should be in prison." And it got a disturbing amount of engagement. Likes, shares, agreement. Think about what that sentiment actually demands. It's demanding that children, some of whom may not have even been old enough to fully understand what was happening, be made to suffer consequences for a crime they had zero involvement in, zero knowledge of, and zero ability to prevent. Honoring Austin Metaf's memory, and I think his memory deserves to be honored, genuinely, does not require destroying children who happen to share a last name with the person responsible for his death. Let's talk money, because this is where a huge amount of the public rage in this case gets concentrated. The family's fundraiser, hosted on the platform GiveSendGo, raised somewhere in the range of $600,000 to $630,000 over the course of the case. To a lot of people online, that number alone reads as an open and shut case of exploitation. Raising money off a tragedy, cashing in on a dead teenager's story. I understand why that's the instinct, but I think it's worth actually running the math before deciding that's what happened. A high-profile murder trial is staggeringly expensive. Private defense attorneys in a case of this magnitude typically run anywhere from $250 to $600 an hour, sometimes more. And that's before you factor in expert witnesses, private investigators, forensic analysts, and the cost of pretrial motions, including, in this case, jury selection challenges that are now central to the appeal. A trial like this one can easily run $300,000 to $500,000 in legal costs alone. Add in an appeal, which by itself can run past $100,000 more, and you start to see how a $600,000 fund doesn't necessarily translate to profit. Add relocation costs, because this family, like the victim's family, has had to move because of security concerns. Plus lost income from parents who've had to step away from work, plus ordinary housing and living expenses for a family of 6. And that number starts looking a lot less like a windfall and a lot more like a family barely staying afloat. Now, to their credit, when the family has been asked directly about this, including through fact-checking outlets, they've maintained that no money was used to purchase property or vehicles, a specific claim that circulated widely online and was found to be false by independent fact-checkers. Whether every dollar of that fund is fully accounted for publicly is a fair question. But we don't have full transparency, and this is definitely fraud, are two very different conclusions. and a lot of public commentary has treated the second as settled fact when it really isn't. All right. If you're still with me at this point, drop a comment that says, "Accountability matters." I want to know who's actually distinguishing between real accountability and just plain revenge, because that's the whole point of this video. This is Brian's criminal unmasking, and I'm not interested in feeding outrage for its own sake. I want the full picture. If that's what you're here for, make sure you're subscribed, because we're not close to done with this case. Now, I want to talk about something a lot of coverage has danced around, and I'm not going to pretend I have it all figured out, but it's worth naming directly. The racial dimension of how this backlash has unfolded. There's a pattern that's been observed across a lot of high-profile criminal cases, and it's this. When a white defendant is at the center of a major case, media coverage tends to make room for a certain kind of complexity. Mental health gets discussed. Personal trauma gets discussed. Parents get sympathetic platforms to explain their child as an aberration, a tragic exception, not a reflection of how they were raised. There's room culturally for complicated grief. When the defendant is black, the framing very often shifts almost immediately to individual moral failure and family accountability. The parents' finances get scrutinized. Their parenting gets publicly graded. The assumption of "how did this happen" gets aimed less at circumstance and more at the family itself. I want to be careful here, because I don't think every piece of criticism aimed at Kayla Hayes is racially motivated. That would be an oversimplification in its own right. And plenty of people criticizing the family would say, genuinely, that race has nothing to do with their frustration. But the sheer speed and intensity of the backlash in this specific case has led a lot of commentators, including some prominent civil rights voices, to argue that black mothers in these situations are held to a standard of public perfection that white parents in comparable cases simply aren't held to. That's an argument being made publicly by real people following this case. It's not something I'm asserting as settled fact, and reasonable people, including members of the victim's own family, have pushed back on the idea that race is the central factor here at all. I think it's worth you sitting with both sides of that, rather than me telling you which one is correct. Let's talk about doxing specifically, because I don't think people who've never experienced it understand how it actually escalates. Once someone's personal information is out there, a real or believed to be real home address, a workplace, a routine, it doesn't stay theoretical for long. It turns into harassing calls, packages, people showing up. And in cases like this one, it has, in documented instances involving both families in this case, escalated to swatting, fake emergency calls designed to send armed police to someone's home under false pretenses. That is not a hypothetical risk in this story. It's something that's already happened to both families multiple times, and it is exactly as dangerous as it sounds. Armed officers responding to a residence based on a lie, with everyone involved not knowing in that first tense minute whether the threat is real. And here's the trap at the center of all of it. Every single move the Anthony family makes gets used against them. If they go quiet, they're accused of hiding something. If they relocate for safety, they're accused of running from accountability. If they decline interview requests, they're accused of being ashamed, or worse, guilty by implication. There is no available action that reads to a hostile public as just a family trying to survive an impossible situation. Every choice gets reinterpreted as evidence. And the mother, specifically, is expected to perform her grief in a very narrow, very specific way. If she doesn't publicly apologize enough, she's branded a monster. If she does apologize, and she has publicly multiple times, she gets accused of being performative, manipulative, insincere. At a certain point, she and her husband stop being treated as individuals with their own inner lives and start being treated purely as symbols other people project their anger onto. So let's step back and ask the actual question underneath all of this. What is accountability supposed to look like here? And where does it end? Karmelo Anthony is in prison. He was convicted by a jury. He was sentenced to 35 years. That is where legal accountability sits, and it has been enforced fully by the system that exists to enforce it. So here's a question worth actually sitting with. Is it fair or even realistic to demand that a mother completely sever ties with her son and publicly disown him? as some online commentary has demanded. I'd argue that's not really accountability at all. It's a demand for a kind of performance that satisfies an audience rather than serving any actual purpose. And there's a practical angle here too. Carmelo Anthony is going to serve at minimum 17 and a half years before he's even eligible for parole. His family, flawed, grieving, controversial as they may be in the public eye, represents essentially his only remaining connection to the outside world for the length of that sentence. Every credible study on rehabilitation inside the prison system points to the same conclusion. Inmates who maintain family contact have dramatically better outcomes than those who don't. Strip that connection away entirely, and you're not creating justice. You're just manufacturing a more bitter, more isolated person who eventually comes back out into society, if he's paroled at all, having had every human tether to normal life deliberately cut. There's also a broader precedent worth being uncomfortable about. If we as a culture normalize the idea that guilt is collective, that punishment can be inherited simply by sharing a last name or a household with someone who did something terrible, that's a precedent that doesn't stay contained to this one family. It's a standard that, applied consistently, makes every relative of every convicted person fair game. No bystander in that world is actually safe from becoming collateral damage in someone else's crime. So here's where this leaves us. The Anthony family is, without question, under sustained public fire. Some of it understandable given how deeply this case cut into a community, and some of it, I think, genuinely disproportionate to anything they've actually done. The real question worth asking, the one I'd leave you with, is this. Does targeting Kayla Hayes, or Andrew Anthony, or their younger children, actually serve any purpose beyond satisfying an audience's anger? Is this accountability, or is it just vengeance wearing accountability's clothes? Thank you for watching Brian's Criminal Unmasking Crime. If this one made you think, hit that notification bell, share it with someone who needs to hear the fuller version of this story, and drop a comment with where you land on all of this. I want the conversation, not just the outrage. This is not over, not even close. Stay tuned for part 3. We are just getting started.